I'm David Hurst. I'm the editor of the Middle East Eye, and I'm delighted to have with me Mohamed Okda, who is a Syrian expert and an MEE contributor, and he's really just come back from the front line of his inquiries, which is the Turkish-Syrian border. And I'd like to talk to you, Mohamed, about your take on what is happening at the peace talks. This is a second round of talks that have been held in Astana in Kazakhstan, hosted by the Russians. We don't have a Geneva process yet. We don't even have really a coherent US administration yet. So tell me, where are we now with the Astana talks? What's actually happened?
During my trip, I visited some of the negotiators who represented the rebels in Astana, and I met them immediately after the return from the first round of Astana. And talking to them, they appeared cautiously hopeful. And the more important thing that you were talking about is this is the first process where actually the people who are represented on the ground has a seat now at the table.
Because before that, there was a disconnect between the people talking and the people fighting.
Yeah, most of the people who represented the Syrian opposition before in Geneva and Vienna and multiple talks before, they didn't really have any representation on the ground, particularly military representation on the ground between the fighting forces of the rebel forces. And this is the first time that we do see someone, for example, like Mohamed representative of the Jaish al-Islam, and other groups who are at the talk. So this by itself is a positive sign. The second thing, this is hosted by the Russians and supported by Turkey. That is, I consider it's a very positive sign, and even for the rebels, we consider this as a positive sign. And a power talks are dependent on the ceasefire, and I've just made a couple of phone calls before this interview, and the ceasefire, basically it's a one-way ceasefire from the rebel, and the Russian haven't stopped bombardment. Over the last few days there were, and up to the rebels' estimate, over 300 air raids against them in Daraa and Damascus countryside and Idlib countryside. So they don't feel really that the Russians are serious about a real ceasefire and about a step forward to take this negotiation forward. They are threatening right now to withdraw from the talks if there's no ceasefire, and they reserve the right to retaliate for the breaking of the ceasefire. So it's a very tense situation, but looking back at how they felt about the Astana one, if we call the Astana one, at that meeting, the Russian represented them with a draft constitution for the future of Syria. And right from the get-go, this is, a calculated mistake, if I would say, because a constitution has to be drafted by Syrians. At the end they have to draft that, but now they have basically a paper of constitution that fell from Russian hands into their hands. And they told me they refused to read it. I couldn't really get any information about it, but from the whispers we get around, it's more or less a transitional constitution with a representative from the rebels in the new government, and there won't really talk about the future of Assad. That is still a question mark.
When Aleppo or East Aleppo fell to the Russians, there were, or to the regime, there were all sorts of indications of tensions between the Russians and the Iranians, who are the other backers of Assad. Can you talk me through that?
Yes, if you look at the Iran and how it looks at Syria, it's more of a sectarian ideological look at Syria, and also at the relation between Iran and Hezbollah and the supply lines from Hezbollah from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. But also the Iranians look at Syria as a Shia battleground, and it's a follow-up to the Shia battleground in Iraq. and it's a dominance, if you would say, from the Persian Empire, from Iran heading west. I mean, if we see the Persian Empire under the Islamic Shiism, or even before that, always was looking west toward the Mediterranean. And this is how traditionally they look at the issues. And they had, during this last 5 years of the conflict, they had infiltrated lots of the Syrian government institutions, and we can see whole neighborhoods in Damascus. The landscape had to change from Sunni or Christian or mixed to a purely Shiite neighborhood with Hezbollah flags flying, Iranian flags flying everywhere. The Russians, however we look at the Russians, they're still secular. In a way, they're not sectarians. They have their own agendas, but it's more a political, strategic influence agenda. But it's not a sectarian, religious agenda like Iran, and that's create tension. And of course, these are two. I mean, Iran is the hegemon in this area, but Russia is a superpower. So there is always a tension between the hegemon and the superpower.
And also, if you actually look at the Muslim population in the Federation of Russia, it's overwhelmingly Sunni.
Yes, yes, and they actually, from what we hear from them and what we hear from also the Russian media, they are overwhelmingly in support of the Russian intervention in Syria right now. But there is also another dimension to that when it comes to the Alawite and the Assad regime and the supporters of the regime in Syria right now. Talking to some of them, talking to some of their foes as well, when they look at Iran, they see a dominant sectarian religious power who is not coherent with their own beliefs. If you look at the Syrian regime, or even the Sunnis who are supporters of the Syrian regime, and others, they are usually secular. We can say even they like to have a good time. While Iran is a very fanatical regime, very close, they would like, to impose their version of Shiite Islam on everyone. So the Syrian regime is more comfortable with the Russians, and the Russians haven't really tried to infiltrate the Syrian regime as much as Iran did. So that creates its own tensions in the whole mix.
Also, if Assad were to chuck the peace process and decide, for instance, to carry on against the rebel positions in Aleppo countryside and in Idlib, you need bombers to do it.
He will read. I mean, the Russian Air Force is basically the Syrian Army Air Force. They are the one who's supporting the operation on the ground. But the ground troops usually have been Hezbollah, has been Iranian militia, and the Iraqi Hezbollah, and some of the Iraqi militias. I don't think Assad has enough troops on the ground, even with a collective of the Shiite militias, to go against Idlib and against Aleppo countryside.
So he needs the Russians to do that.
He needs the Russians to do it. He needs the Russians as air power and also as troops on the ground. And it is clear there is no Russian political decision to do this right now. The priority for the Russians and for Americans, if you would say, and also the Turks, are to fight Daesh. And there's some focus now in Mosul, but also Raqqa in Syria will be the second stage. And they just don't have enough troops to go after Idlib right now.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the options are for the rebels? We know that Ahrar Sham has split. Tell us a bit about what you know in the rebel camp about the various factions, and also what their options are.
Well, I mean, if you look at Ahrar Sham, they had leadership, we can call it election, a couple of months ago. And this leadership, a split happened, and now the leadership of Ahrar is more or less the traditional Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, and some people who lean more or less to the Salafi jihadist ideology, not necessarily extremism, but just the pure Salafism, didn't really like that, and didn't like that current leadership, so they split and they merged with other groups. One of them is Jabhat Fath al-Sham, which was a Nusra front before, and Harakat Nuruddin Zinki, which was one of the largest group in Aleppo countryside, and Luwa al-Haq, and two smaller groups. But
that group will continue fighting.
They will continue to fight.
They won't participate in any peace talks.
They will not, and they clearly stated that they will not. And actually, they are calling the people or the other rebels who participate in the peace talk of Astana as traitors and not good doers. But if you look at this newly formed Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they have their own problems within themselves. There's a lot of infighting. There's a lot of kidnapping happening as we speak, actually, in Idlib and in Aleppo countryside. But if they get over their differences and go ahead, they will definitely keep fighting. And they have no option but to keep fighting. And they are worried that if a peace deal happened through the process with the Russians, either it is in Astana or Geneva in the future, that the other rebels like Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar and the Free Syrian Army, their main job would be policing the other rebel groups who did not sign the proposed peace agreement, and under the pretext of fighting extremism and radicalization. So that was going to create its own problems in the future.
How can you just give me some size of the rebel force that will continue to fight, as opposed to the number of fighters who are now sticking more to the peace process?
That will be a very rough estimate, but based on my interviews with different rebel forces and different observers, and having visited the border areas, the rough estimate will be around 30 to 40,000. And this includes anywhere from Idlib, whole of Idlib, city and province, Aleppo countryside, Hama countryside, Homs countryside, southern front, and also Damascus countryside. And this does not include any Daesh forces in it. This is all excluding Daesh.
And if you were to actually say to them, if the other rebels go towards some form of transitional arrangement, ask them what they would be fighting for. What would they say?
Well, they would be fighting for the Syrian revolution. I mean, for them, the Syrian revolution is not complete. Assad is still in power. The sectarian Alawite regime is still in power. Hezbollah. I mean, you have to look at how they perceive this conflict. And if you look at both sides of the rebels who are pro the talks, against the talks, you do see Syria right now as an occupied country, occupied by foreign troops, either Russians, Iran, Hezbollah, Shiite militias, and others, and they would like to see this go. So both sides would like to see that, but both of them are going about it in a different direction. One is through negotiation and politics, which is not very successful, and also the other one is through military campaign, which is also not very successful. And I think they're going to have to make a choice to decide what is going to be the future of the conflict. My own opinion is some of the groups are going to sign some kind of a peace agreement. It could be under the form of an extended ceasefire with some safe areas, and there is some political process in the future. But the more ideological, and I don't want to use the word extremist, but the more ideological groups will continue fighting on in different forms, and I'm afraid that will erode some discipline, and we're going to see a lot more violence going on in these areas.
And finally, what about Trump, and what about US policy?
Well, the US policy, I will comment, and I was just in America a few weeks ago. and looking at the current status of the Trump administration, it is a ship without a rudder. There is no national security advisor, and the previous one, from what we hear from the reporting and the media and the news, his main interest was Russia, and to please the Russians for whatever reasons that is. And we see an administration that's controlled by a right-wing policy like Steve Bannon and others, and there's no coherent policy. So my 2 cents about it: American administration is absent when it comes to Syria. State Department is absent, and there's no really a real plan for Syria. My own instinct for everything I see, I think most likely Trump administration is going to follow the Russian lead and try to have an American-Russian deal on Syria, and Russia will be the lead on it, and maybe with a little bit of support from the Europeans. But I think it will be Russia first, Turkey second, and then everyone else.
Thank you, Mohamed.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.